Alright, welcome to the next episode of Flight Sim School. Today's video is going to be a bit of a continuation of last week where we were looking at wind and how we deal with it in all stages of flight. This week we're going to be looking at the different settings that we can control in the game before we head out on our flight, and then once we're up in the air, looking at the settings that we can change and how they affect our flight from the moment we change those settings. So we'll have a quick look at all of that, and then we'll jump into the cockpit and do a few different things with the wind settings, and then just wrap up. So let's jump straight into the simulator. Alright, so once you've got the game loaded up, before we go into the world map, just make sure to go into your options and make sure that under the flight model, you've got it set to modern. This is what it's set to by default, so unless you started fooling around with the settings, it should still be like that, but you want that to be set to modern just to make sure that you're using the more current generation of physics in the game. Without that, you would end up using potentially an older version of the physics, which might have an impact on the wind settings that we're going to look at in this video. So once that's done, go into the world map. And what we're going to do is just set up our flight as usual. So I'll choose my usual Gold Coast Airport. And I'll go into flight conditions here. Alright, so basically there are three different ways that you can set the weather and the wind specifically, which is what we're looking at in this video in Flight Sim. So the first one is obviously just using the live weather settings. If you use this, it'll download the data from the internet and basically set the winds and all the other weather components to whatever is currently happening at that location. There has been some mixed reviews about this online in the forums. A few people have said there's a few issues with it. It does seem to work okay, as long as you're not looking for too much precision. I think it'll be fine. There's the other option, which is the preset values, and these are just a bunch of presets that have been set here that have been created ahead of time. These have existed in other versions of Flight Simulator. Feels a bit like a port of that setting with basically a bunch of preset settings. So a lot of these will include a bunch of different configurations for the weather as well as the wind. You can't really control it though. The ultimate way to handle winds is of course to go into the custom setting, and that's what we're going to look at mostly for today. What is neat about the custom settings is you can also save some presets, and these are actually the presets that we saw on the other screen as well, but I also have a custom one here. That's kind of neat because you can do it once, hit save, and then every time you want to use it, you basically can just select it from that drop down list. It's a lot better than trying to do everything yourself by hand every single time. So what we're going to do is we're going to actually go into the game to make this a little bit more fun, and we're going to have a play with the different wind settings that we can set here. Have a look at how they impact our flight, how they impact basically every different part of our flight, and how we can tweak those settings to be a little more difficult or a little bit easier on us depending on what we're trying to achieve. And then we'll just wrap up, and I might try a crosswind landing in my Cub at the maximum crosswind levels just for fun to see how that looks in the game. Alright, so let's get in the cockpit and start playing with wind. Alright, so we're back in the cockpit and we're ready to start looking at wind. So to bring up the wind menu in game, you just go here and you click on weather, and we get the same menu that we saw in the world map. So what we're going to do for this flight to start off is we're going to set some ground level winds. By default, I think it comes, I'm on the clear skies preset. It comes with wind blowing from west to east at 2 knots, which is about 5 kilometers an hour or so. A quick way to convert from knots to kilometers an hour is basically just multiply by 2 It's not exactly the right calculation, but it's close enough to give you an approximation of what it should actually be. So what we're going to do is we're going to set our ground winds to be a little bit higher actually before we take off. So if I set it, let's say, to 10 knots, I don't know if you guys can actually hear it or not. But as you increase the wind speed, let's say I put it up to 30 just for fun, you can actually hear it blowing. So hopefully you can hear that in the recording as well. Alright, so what we're going to do is we're actually going to set ourselves up with a crosswind takeoff. So I am on runway 32 at the airport, which we can't quite see right there. So what I'm going to actually do is I'm going to make the wind blow out of the southwest so that it is coming almost directly across the runway. Right around there or so. And I'll set the gusts to be the same direction. We'll talk about gusts once we're airborne. There's a few details that I need to go into about how it all works and a few issues that people have had with it. But I want to look at that once we're airborne and we can look at it more properly. So now all we've got is we've got a wind blowing from the southwest towards the northeast at 30 knots, which is well above our maximum takeoff crosswind speed. So for the Cub, it's at around 15 knots or 30 kilometers an hour. So I'm gonna set it to, let's say, 13 just to be safe. There we go. So we've got our wind set blowing directly across the field here, so from left to right across the screen, and gusts at the same thing, and like I said, we'll look at that once we're airborne. The way the wind works with this little guy here, what happens is Flight Sim will actually use a gradient to decide how the winds are going to be from the ground level up. You can also add more wind layers if you like. So if you were going to be going on a flight that you're going to be, say, going above 10,000 feet, which we're not going to be doing right now, but let's say we were, you could add a wind layer here, and you could basically bring that up to there so that you could have different winds above 10,000 feet or whatever altitude you decide to choose. Now, unlike the clouds, which you specify a top altitude and a bottom altitude for where you want the cloud layer, the wind doesn't have that setting. It's really just the wind is set at a given position, and Flight Sim basically takes care of calculating the curve of wind as you descend and ascend throughout the game. So before we head off, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to save this as a preset for when we're going to be landing later, so that I don't have to reset this by hand. So what I will do is I'll click this little save button here, and I will call this Gold Coast Crosswind, Max Crosswind. Alright. So now, when we're landing later and I want to put these conditions back in play, I can really just come in the drop down and choose Gold Coast Max Crosswind, and I'll be all set to do my Max Crosswind landing. Alright, with all that set, I think we're ready for takeoff. So again, we've got the winds blowing from left to right. I will do the initial takeoff roll from the external view. It's just so much easier, especially with a tail dragger like the Cub. And once we're in the air, we'll start our crab to not get blown off course. And then what we're going to do is we're going to turn out to sea. We'll climb to around 3,000 feet or so, and we'll start playing around with the wind and the gusts to see what we can achieve with it. Alright, so let's head off. So as usual, I apply full power. Tail comes up fairly quickly, and you can see the winds really blowing us around. Alrighty. So we are airborne. And we'll have to have that slight crab into the wind to keep on our runway heading. so I'm about 312, which is about 8 degrees. So if you've watched a previous video, you have to turn into the wind to hold a given heading when you're trying to fly that heading specifically. So in my case, I'm at around 310 to fly that 320 heading, and if we look at the top-down view, you can see I am very much crapped into the wind here. My plane is basically sideways trying to fly in this 15 knot crosswind, which is the maximum allowed basically to take off in this plane. Alrighty, so I am going to turn out to sea, and since there's nothing really to see from here until we reach pattern altitude, I'll probably just meet you guys there in a second. Alright, so here we are at around 3,000 feet, and we basically still have our wind set that we had at takeoff, which we're going to go look at right now. And what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the last few settings in terms of weather. And those are specifically the gust settings. So there's been a lot of chatter on the Flight Simulator forums about gusts and about winds in general. And there were some issues initially when the game was released, but it seems that in the last few releases a lot of those bugs have been sorted out. And from what I can tell now in the game, the gusts are pretty much responding as how I would expect them. Sometimes I will have some weird randomness I can't quite explain, but usually it's because I've configured something incorrectly rather than a game issue. So gusts have a direction just like the wind does. In general, a gust will come from the same direction as the wind, and that's why in my settings here I've got the wind gusting from the same heading as the base wind that we have configured at 13 knots for our max crosswind landing. The gusts can have one of three settings. They can either match the exact wind speed of the actual wind, they can be below the wind speed of the wind, or they can be above the wind speed of the wind. So if the gust matches exactly the wind speed, then basically there is no gusts, which is the current conditions that we're seeing right here, which is why my plane is just flying straight ahead and not really having too much bumpiness, because the gusts are set to match the winds. I accomplished that by setting the speed of the gust to 100% here. So basically that tells it create a gust that matches the exact same thing as the wind. So we've got 13 knots here and 13 knots here. So it basically means they cancel each other out, and we've just got a headwind, we've got a wind blowing at 13 knots. The other thing you can do is you can actually lower the gusts to anywhere between 50 and 100%. So if I were to drop the slider down here, we're going to see the plane starts getting a little bumpy. And the reason for that is because what we've done now is we've actually told it to have a lull in the wind. So what's happening is the wind is still blowing at 13 knots, but the gusts are actually lulls down to 8 knots. The other configuration that you can do, of course, is instead of going below 100%, you can go above 100%. So you can go up to 200% if you want. And as you can see, when you do drag that slider above 100%, you'll see that we've still got our base wind of 13, and now we've got gusts up to 20. And if I really wanted, I could pump it all the way up to 25 knots to have a really bumpy ride for our passengers in our virtual plane. The other setting that you can configure is the frequency at which the wind gusts, and that's this controlled by this here. So if you have a longer frequency, it basically means there are going to be less gusts, basically one gust approximately every 60 seconds, or you can bring it down to have a gust every 10 seconds. And the smaller you have, the more gusting there will be, and the higher you have it, the less gusting there will be, or at least less frequently than you would otherwise. Alright, the other thing we're going to look at now, just before we head back to the airport for our landing, is we're going to play with some stronger winds. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn directly into the wind, And actually, you know what we'll do? We'll actually just bring the wind to us. Let's just have a little bit of fun here. So I'll just point my plane north. There we go. I will set the wind to blow from the north to the south. And I will set the gusts to match so that we don't get buffeted around by the wind. Just let the plane restabilize itself. So we've got a wind coming straight at us right now. And just to continue on what we looked at in the previous flight, which was headwinds and tailwinds, how it affects your ground speed. So if we have a look at the top-down view, you can see that we're moving forward over the water at a fairly decent clip. Now, if I were to increase these winds to, let's say, 30 knots, which is a bit fast for this plane, but we will see very quickly, well, one, you can see that the water actually is a lot more active. You can probably hear it in the sound of the game as well. You can hear the wind blowing that much harder. And if we have a look at the top-down view, you can see we're now moving a little bit slower forward than we were before. So just for fun, let's pump this up even more. Let's say to 40 knots. And now if we look at the top-down view, you can see we basically have no more forward momentum because the winds are just blowing so hard that our plane is struggling to move forward. So we're traveling at 70-ish knots right now with a headwind of 40 knots. That means our ground speed is close to 30 knots or so, which really isn't going to get us anywhere fast at all. So you can have a play around with that. And let's actually do the opposite now. Let's make the wind come from the opposite direction, from the south. Ooh. Sorry plane. It's really not liking the wind and gusts there, so let's just fix that. Okay. So that was a bit of a bumpy ride. It doesn't usually happen in a real plane, luckily, because the winds don't drastically change directions like that. So I'll just let the airspeed build back up for a second so that we can hold our altitude. And now we've basically got a wind blowing us, a tailwind. And if we were to look down now, we can see we're moving a lot faster over the ground than we were before. So our airspeed now, our ground speed, sorry, is closer to 40 plus 60, which is closer to 100 knots, which you can tell a fair bit with the water as it is there. Alrighty, so I think with that done, we're pretty much ready to head back towards the airport. Before doing that, I will reset my winds to the defaults so that we are set up when we arrive at the airport. So we're gone back now just by selecting in the drop down that preset that we did previously in this flight, and by selecting it, basically it reset all the wind values, which we can see here. So we're back winds at 13 knots from the southwest, and gusts that basically match it. So I am going to head back towards the airport now, and I will meet up with you once we're a little bit closer, because as you can see, we're kind of far out at sea right now, and there won't be much to see between here and there. So I will meet you back as I'm joining the traffic pattern. Alright, so welcome back. I have just entered the downwind leg of my traffic pattern here, and we've got winds and we've got some turbulence as well, just being so low to the ground, and with the amount of wind that we've got, it's getting a little bumpy out here. So we are going to make our best attempt at landing in the maximum crosswinds that are rated for this plane. So I don't usually use flaps for landing, but in this case I will use 1 notch just to try and stabilize the plane a little bit more than usual. Usually though, I don't actually use them for the Cub. It's such a slow moving plane that I just don't feel like they're really necessary. So there we go past the runway threshold. We'll just start a very slow descent. We'll reduce power ever so slightly. Like I've mentioned in other videos, I like around 3,500 RPM in the Cub to start that descent. And then as we get closer, I will move down to around 2,700 RPM for final.
Clear to land runway 32 Sackage Romeo 37.
So we've got our landing approval right there, so I will start our turn since the wind is blowing from the east to west. Well, from right to left, sorry. And continue that descent. I'll reduce power just a wee little bit more. Now the wind's going to be right at my back here, so I'm going to have to turn final fairly quickly. Alrighty, there we go. There's the runway. Let's reduce power just a wee bit more now. Okie dokie, here we go. Turn final. We've got our final approach power set, and now I'm just going to crab into the wind. And I think I'll switch to the external view because it's just that wee bit easier. Just need a little bit of a touch more power. We've got our approach speed is pretty good. So again, I'm just going to descend to around 200 feet, at which point I'm going to do the side slip where I'm going to bank my wings into the wing and use opposite rudder to basically hold the plane down the runway center line. So I'm just going to move us that wee bit more. There we go. And now I can line us with the runway. There we go. Bank those wings to slide us a little bit and use the rudder to keep us down the runway center line, just like that. I'm just trying to keep that approach speed respectable and maintain a very slow descent. So I've got that left wing down and the rudder pointing the other direction to just bring us down. And looks like we're gonna make it. Won't be pretty, but there we go. Alright. So once again, I hope you learned something useful for getting started with Flight Simulator 2020. If you like this video, make sure to like and subscribe, and if you have any questions or comments, make sure to put them in the comments box below. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye. Alright, so here we are back in the game in the wrong plane.